I think we're ready to start. My name is Tom Leonard. I'm president of TPI, and I want to welcome you to this session on the evolving media landscape. What are the data show? The enforcement of IP rights in the digital economy is of critical importance, and nowhere is that more important than in the creative industries where intellectual property is protected by copyright. As we all know, the advent of the internet and of digital distribution channels has made the protection of intellectual property more difficult. But there's been some debate about what the effects of all this are on the creative industries and on social welfare overall, and more importantly, on the best strategies to address the issue and to make the copyright regime work the way we would like it to. We have today with us three of the most distinguished scholars that are working in this area who've actually analyzed the data and are attempting to answer some of these questions. We're first going to hear from Mike Smith of Carnegie Mellon, who we're delighted to say has recently joined TPI as an adjunct senior fellow, and Mike is going to give the initial presentation, who's going to be followed by Joel Waldfogel and Alejandro Zentner. As I indicated, Mike is a professor at Carnegie Mellon, professor of information systems and marketing at Carnegie Mellon, and he is also co-director of IDEA, the Initiative for Digital Entertainment Analytics at Carnegie Mellon University. Mike?
Thanks. Would it be okay if I just stood up here? Can everybody hear me reasonably well? Okay.
So you want to? I mean, if this is being recorded, so we probably have it on the microphone.
Right. Okay. No, not at all. Is this good? Okay. So I want to thank Tom and TPI for inviting me to join them as a senior policy fellow, and also for putting this together, and for everyone to come out and hear this. My colleagues and I have been running this center at Carnegie Mellon, trying to think about how can you use data to analyze a set of important questions around how technology is changing the creative industries. The three questions I'm going to present to you today are: number one, does piracy harm sales? Number two, can you compete with that by using legal digital distribution channels? And number three, can you use anti-piracy measures to also compete with piracy? And in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to try to convince you that the data suggests that the answer to each of these questions is yes. Yes, piracy harms sales, and that's the dominant conclusion of the vast majority of the academic papers on this. Yes, if you offer your content on legal digital distribution channels, some people who would have pirated will switch over to buy legally. Now, I want to be clear, your knee-jerk reaction will be, okay, then the solution to the problem is let's distribute everything on all channels from day one. I'd be happy to address that question in the question and answer time, because I think it's much more complicated than that. And the third question is, yes, if you make it harder to consume piracy by making it legally more risky or harder to find, that some people who would have pirated will come over and buy legally. Okay? So let me try to convince you this, starting with does piracy harm sales? A variety of papers have looked at this. Some papers have found that there's no statistical effect of piracy. And I'd be happy to talk about any of these papers in more detail in the question and answer time. You'll also notice that one of my papers is up here on the left-hand side. I'd be happy to talk about that. What's interesting is if you just read the website's Torrent Freak, you would think these are the only papers that have ever been published on this topic. If you're following the design of the slide, you'll recognize what happens next. On the other side of the ledger, we found 29 academic papers that looked at this question and found a statistically significant negative impact of piracy. Yep.
What's the fifth paper on the no?
Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, there was a paper out of the University of Mannheim that initially said piracy hurts sales, and then recently changed its, and so it's in enough flux right now that I decided to drop it off. What they're now finding is, I'll get into that in the Q&A time if you want. Okay. The gold standard of academic quality is, can you get your paper published in a peer-reviewed academic journal? Right? Can you send this out to a blind process where people who are trained in your methods comment on your work and approve it as credible? If you limit it to just those papers that have been published in peer-reviewed journals, these are the numbers. If you limit it to just those papers that have been published in what would commonly be considered top peer-reviewed journals, these are the numbers. The other thing I'll say is there's some significant caveats associated with the two papers that haven't found piracy impact sales. In the case of our paper, we were looking at piracy in the broadcast television window, so 2 to 3 years after a movie has been released. We didn't see evidence of harm. On the other side of the ledger, we have a paper that looks at pre-release piracy and finds about a 20% negative impact of piracy on sales if it's available prior to the theatrical release. Okay. That's the first question, and I think that's pretty intuitive. That's exactly what you would expect piracy to do. The next question is, can you do anything about competing with it? If piracy exists and you market your content on legal digital channels, will that cause anybody to switch over? And in this context, we've leveraged a set of what I'll call natural experiments. Settings where one firm or one part of the market changes something, and you can compare the behavior of that part of the market to a control group of other parts of the market that don't change, and use that as the signal of what happens. And let me explain what that means. NBC in 2007 got into a dispute with Apple, and for a period of time removed all of their content off of iTunes. This is a perfect natural experiment for us, because we can then compare what happens to piracy, and oh, by the way, what happens to Amazon DVD sales after this for the treatment group of NBC relative to the control group of ABC, CBS, and Fox. So I had a really bright doctoral student who gathered all of this data, and the answer is, after NBC took its content off of iTunes, there was about 11% increase in NBC piracy relative to ABC, CBS, and Fox. That increase was about twice as large as the number of sales NBC was getting on iTunes before they went off. So, what's your name? Corey. So I'll pick on Corey, right? So when Corey was pirating, he would, so when Corey was buying on iTunes, he was getting 1 or 2 pieces of content. When he started pirating, he got everything, right? The other interesting thing here is piracy on the control group went up. Now, we're careful in the paper to say this is not well identified. I'm not sure what would have happened, but one reasonable interpretation of this is when Corey figured out how to pirate his NBC content, he also started pirating his ABC, CBS, and Fox content as well. Okay. The other interesting thing here is there was no change in DVD sales, DVD box set sales, which I will admit to you is not a perfect measure. But what it might mean is that the digital consumer isn't considering the physical product as a strong substitute for digital consumption. Okay, and I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A time. The other thing we found is that there was a smaller decrease in piracy when NBC came back than the initial increase we saw, which again might mean that once Corey learns how to pirate, it's hard to get it back. Fair? Similar setting, ABC and Hulu. ABC adds their content to Hulu, and we can use the control group as the other networks who didn't change, who either were on Hulu and continue to be on Hulu, or weren't on Hulu and continue to not be on Hulu. Similar set of data. And quite frankly, a similar result. We see about an 18% decrease in ABC piracy after it adds its content to Hulu. And we see an additional 7% decrease in the control group. Almost as if, again, there's this spillover effect associated with piracy, and no change in DVD sales. Here's another one we've looked at. Publisher X and Amazon. They had a setting where they had almost a natural experiment where they delayed books by varying amounts of time on Kindle relative to on hardcover. And if you tease out the numbers, what it suggests is that when you delay a book's release on Kindle, there's statistically no increase in hardcover sales. That when people can't get it on Kindle, they don't switch over to hardcover sales. But there's about a 50% decrease in book sales when the book is made available on Amazon. Almost as if when Corey goes to Amazon and he can't find the Kindle, he doesn't consider the hardcover to be a good substitute, and he goes and does something else. And I'm not going to impugn his motives and you know, attribute what he does, but he doesn't come back and buy later. We also have a paper that looks at iTunes availability. A particular studio was making their catalog movies available on iTunes. What happens to piracy on those movies when they become available on iTunes? Piracy goes down by about 6.5%. And the last one, which I'm sort of excited, two weeks ago, China censored 4 major US television shows on legal Chinese streaming sites. So these were legally licensed on a set of streaming sites in China. The Chinese government took them down, and the question is, does piracy change? This is, and I haven't beaten these up a whole lot, and my research assistant, Chris Pope, just put these together. This is piracy in China on these 4 shows. And the red period is after they were taken down. And it sure looks like piracy went up significantly on these 4 shows in China after they were unavailable. What we're hoping to tease out is, was there also a spillover effect on other shows? Okay, does that make sense? All right, Corey, have I picked on you enough? Okay. Here's the, so and again, that's sort of intuitive. Right? If you make content available in a digital channel, some people who would pirate might switch over. The next question is, can you use anti-piracy measures to change people's behavior? There's a very strong argument that you can make that anti-piracy measures won't work. This is Nick Bilton in the New York Times. Internet pirates will always win. And the crux of his argument is, you'll never be able to perfectly shut down piracy. Piracy is always going to be available. Given that it's always available, people are going to be able to find it. Given that people are going to be able to find it, let's not try in the first place. Okay? I agree with the premise. I disagree with the conclusion. Right? I agree with the premise that you're never going to be able to perfectly shut down piracy. I disagree with the conclusion, and I wonder whether you can make it sufficiently difficult to pirate that a significant number of people will switch over. This is where I'm going to try to spend most of the remaining time we've got together. We've looked at this in the context of what I'll call demand-side anti-piracy and supply-side anti-piracy. Demand-side anti-piracy focuses on Corey. I lied. I am going to pick on so demand-side anti-piracy focuses.
That's what we pay him for.
Oh, you fake name. He just has to sit here and take it? Okay. So demand-side anti-piracy is focusing on the actual consumer. An example of this is the Hadopi law in France. The Hadopi law was a classic graduated response 3 strikes regime. If Corey was a French citizen and he was found to be pirating by the creative industries once, he would receive a nasty email. If he was found pirating twice, he would receive a registered letter. And if he was found pirating 3 times, they could take him to court and fine him and even kick him off the internet, whatever that means. To analyze the effectiveness of this, what we did is we got data from the 4 major, now 3, record labels in the US for their digital sales through a major digital platform. And compared sales changes in France to sales changes in a set of control group European countries, UK, Italy, Spain, Germany, and Belgium, that prior to the Hadopi law were similar to, had similar sales patterns to France. Okay. And what we're going to find, and I apologize, this is a little bit small, what we find is that before the law goes into effect, these countries, the control group countries and the treatment countries, move relatively similar. At a point in time, sales in France go up relative to the control group. And they go up by about 20 to 25% for albums and singles. what's interesting is the break point for this is well before the law goes into effect. And in fact, it's well before any of the Corys of the world get a notice. So we scratched our heads about this for a while, and overlaid on the graph the number of searches on Google for the term Hadopi by French consumers. And what we found is that when that spiked, that was where the break occurred. And oh, by the way, it spiked when this law was being debated in Parliament, when it was being publicized on the news, but before it went into effect. As economists, we would expect that Cory would wait until he gets his second notice to change his behavior. That's not what we see in the data. The other thing we were able to do is, if this is causal, right? If the change in sales is causally related to the law itself, we ought to see a larger increase in sales for more heavily pirated genres. It ought to be true that for more heavily pirated genres, there are going to be more people affected by the law, therefore we're going to see relatively more people pirated. So we got a survey from one of the labels that showed that rap and hip hop are the most heavily pirated genres, followed by rock and pop, followed by Christian classical, folk, and jazz as the least heavily pirated genres. And if you run the numbers, it shows exactly that rap and hip hop had the highest increase in sales during this time period, followed by rock and pop, followed by a very small increase in Christian classical, folk, and jazz. This paper is forthcoming in the Journal of Industrial Economics, so it's been through the peer review process and thankfully made it through. Okay. Here's another one. Megupload gets shut down. And this, quite frankly, is an even more interesting one in some ways, because Megupload, while it was the largest cyber locker on the internet, it was in no way the only cyber locker on the internet. In fact, at about this time, there was a group of researchers at Northeastern University in Boston who looked at this and argued that all of the content that was previously available on Megupload before it was shut down was still available on other cyber lockers after Megupload was shut down. So again, you can make an argument this isn't going to have any effect. What we did in this case is we got digital movie sales data from each of the major studios and compared the change in sales before and after Megupload was shut down across countries based on how much Megupload use they had previously, right? So the challenge with this analysis is the Department of Justice. If the Department of Justice had come to me and asked, I would have said, what you're doing is you're shutting this down in January and you're shutting it down worldwide. That's going to make it very hard for me to analyze the data, because January is a strange time. It comes right after December, and shutting it down worldwide doesn't give me a good control group. What I'd like for you to do is shut it down in June and vary it randomly across different, surprisingly they didn't ask. So we're left with the data that we have. But what we're doing in the paper is we're saying prior to Megupload's shutdown, there was different usage across countries of Megupload. Spain, apparently about 18% of the Spanish internet population visited Megupload in the month before it was shut down. US, it was closer to 4%. Okay. And we're using that variation in a very similar way to the way we use the variation in usage across, variation in piracy across genres. And what we find is that countries with higher pre-Megupload usage have a higher increase in digital sales after Megupload is shut down than other countries do. And if you believe that, I'd be happy to talk about this in the question and answer time, but if you believe that, what this is saying is that Megupload, the shutdown of Megupload caused somewhere between a 7 to 10% increase in sales, a 4 to 7% increase in rentals, and a 6 to 10% increase in overall revenue of digital movie sales for the studios. This paper came out last month in the Journal of Industrial Economics. Again, a well-respected econ journal, made it through peer review, blah, blah, blah. So we think we're doing this right. Okay. What does this mean? I think one thing this means is, one way to think about piracy is as a competing product. Okay. and it's a competing product that's interesting in two ways. One is it's free, right? Can you compete with free? Well, the answer is yeah, you can compete with free. And you compete with free by, we know how to compete with free. Competing with free is just a special case of price competition. How do I use price competition to compete? Well, I make my product more attractive along a set of attributes that are valuable to the consumer. The other interesting aspect here is, but it's a different sort of competition because you can also compete with free by making free less attractive. And you can make free less attractive by making it legally more risky for Corey. Or you can make it simply harder to find for Corey. And the interesting piece here, I think, is that you don't have to make it impossible to find. You just have to make it a little bit harder to find for Corey, and at least some Corys of the world will switch over to buying through legal channels. This is entirely consistent with all the economic literature on search costs online. All the econ literature looks at the question of search cost online and finds that the Corys of the world online have much higher search costs than what we expected them to. Okay. Does that make sense? Now, you might ask, how does this affect the studio's behavior? And like I said, I'd be happy to address that in the question and answer time. The key thing to remember is all the economic theory suggests that in a world where you have goods that have a high fixed cost and a low marginal cost and radically different valuations across consumers, that the best way to sell goods in that setting is to use what are called price segmentation strategies, to vary the quality, vary the timeliness, vary the usability of the product in a way that allows you to sell to the high value people at a relatively high price, and also provide content to the moderate value and the low value people. So increased participation in the market. Piracy screws with all of those distribution strategies because it creates a competing good that in many cases is superior on quality, timeliness, and usability. So I will argue, and I'd be happy to go into more detail on this, that it's not as simple as just provided in every window all on the first day. Now, the two panelists, and again, I thank Joel and Alejandro for coming. These guys are two of the very, very best. Some of the interesting open questions here are: is society harmed by piracy? Right? So we can demonstrate pretty conclusively that firms are hurt. Is society harmed by piracy? And these guys are going to talk a little bit about that. And again, I think the key question, the second key question is how should firms adapt their existing business models to the reality of piracy and the reality of the digital channels? And again, I'd love to take that up in the question and answer time. These papers are all available. If you're interested in any of them, I'd love for you to send me an email, or they're also available on my website. And I think that's my 20 minutes.
Yeah. Great, thanks. And I think some of them, if not all of them, are available on the TPI website.
Fantastic.
Our next speaker is Joel Waldfogel. Joel holds the Frederick R. Capell Chair in Applied Economics at the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. Previously, he spent many years at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and prior to that was at Yale. And it is a pleasure to have Joel here.
Well, thank you very much. This is really hard. I have two things to control at once. Let's see what we can do. All right, so we didn't coordinate heavily, and yet I knew what Mike was going to say, and I think this will be very, very complimentary, both with a compliment and compliment sense. So my question is, what should we do in piracy's aftermath? I guess if you think about the various we's, one is industry, another is sort of society or government or policy. I think the answer to the first question is simply listen to Mike. I mean, that is, what should industry do? Well, probably learn from the research that Mike and his colleagues have been doing. All right, so but let me get back to that after I talk about sort of some complementary stuff. So a little bit of background. Every talk about piracy begins with one of these sky is falling pictures. And indeed, this is a picture of recorded music revenue across the major economies of the world since 1999 or 1998. And really, it's been a calamitous drop. Even this has digital added back in and so forth. It's really been an enormous drop. So there's been this calamity in recorded music, and there are real threats on the horizon in other industries, movies, books, although there's no calamitous decline like this in those industries, but still, palpable threats. Now, why would we care about revenue? It's sort of obvious why firms whose revenue we're talking about would care about revenue, but why would the larger we care about revenue? And meaning including consumers and producers and therefore public policy. Well, these are investment-intensive industries. The IFPI tells us, and I think that it's true what they say, that music is a very investment-intensive business. The MPAA tells us, and I think it's also true, that it costs $100 million to make an average, one of their average movies. The concern is that weakened revenue could undermine the ability to finance products, which would be bad news not just for sellers, but for buyers as well. So we should care about revenue from a public policy standpoint. But then we should also think about the purpose of copyright. Copyright is supposed to provide rewards and incentives to allow creators to bring their works to market. There's the words from the Constitution as well. And I think the right question for public policy is whether copyright continues to fulfill its function as well as it did, say, before the technological changes that have, among other things, brought us a calamitous drop in revenue to recorded music. It's important, I think, to think about digitization as a two-edged sword. So there's clearly bad news on the demand side. Napster and its ilk have made it possible for people to obtain things without purchasing them. Well, surely that's going to make it harder to generate revenue. You saw the raft of studies. And by the way, I'm all on the it hurts side, so I'm a credible witness, even in the eyes of the RIAA. Actually, I think I'm listed at their website as one of the persons who has a credible study. But at the same time, the costs of bringing products to market have surely declined. I have lots of evidence about that I can talk about in Q&A or maybe even talk. But you think about production and distribution, even promotion, which is a tougher nut. All these costs have gone down. And so that leaves us with a question on balance. Are the existing legal and technological protections sufficient to finance the continued creation of new works? I think that's the relevant question for assessing whether copyright is adequately fulfilling its function. So it's a hard question. But what one can ask, and I'll talk a little bit about evidence on these two questions. Has the flow of new products grown or shrunk in these copyright-protected industries, in movies, in music, and books? And then another important question, are the new products valuable to consumers and producers? It would be cold comfort if we had sort of lots of useless products. Right, so on the number of products, data are always a problem and they're expensive and so forth, but it's pretty clear, for instance, that in recorded music, that there has been a tripling in the number of new products brought to market, whether measured as songs or whatever, between about 2000 and about 2010. And one can see this in various different data sources. So no question, a huge growth in the number of new products brought to market. In books, the growth is even more enormous. There's been I already used the word huge, let me say an astronomical growth in the number of new books brought to market, largely self-published ebooks. So again, one might be concerned that they're all uninteresting. That's a credible concern. In movies, now here it's a little more nuanced. So if you look at major studio releases, those are flat, even down. They're usually around 200, 150. Last few years, the MPAA releases have been around 150, kind of at a low number relative to the past. But if you look at the total number of movies released into theaters in the US, including limited release, you're at numbers like 500, 600 in recent years. And you see the divergence in the right-hand side graph. The upper path is the total number released. The lower two lines are essentially the number of major releases. And if you look at actual production, and this is sort of a funny word, but the number of movies, the number of feature-length, non-documentary movies that have an IMDb page by the vintage in which they were originally released, whatever released means, or created, you see that it has really grown substantially in the last few years. It's up around 3,000 per year in recent years, and much of the growth has occurred in the last 5 years since the development of very low-cost digital camera technology. Here, though, is the question about whether this stuff's any good. This is, of course, a cat in a Roomba. And there's a concern that, is this a good substitute for, Spider-Man 16? No, probably not. This is not very interesting. So is the new stuff any good? I want to talk a little bit about the evidence I can assemble on that to try to address that question. So in music, now, let's concede this is a hard question. If I didn't have tenure, I wouldn't try to answer it, but I think it's important. One approach to the question is the new stuff any good? And I should say, when I say good, although that sounds like an aesthetic word, I really mean economically good. Does it generate demand and therefore well-being for producers and consumers? Notwithstanding that I just said that, my first approach to this good question or valuable question does rely on aesthetic judgments of critics who make these best of the decade or best of all time lists. I found a lot of such lists, like 100 of them or so, and one can take these lists and transform them into indices, the number of works originally released in this year, that year, and so forth. If I statistically splice those indices together, what I come up with is that the quality of music rose from 1960 to 1970. It fell after 1970. Maybe there's a bit of a rise in the mid-90s. It's falling as Napster approaches, and then after Napster, it goes flat. Flat's interesting, perhaps, because remember, revenue is just tanking in this period. So in contrast to revenue that's fallen to zero, the sort of number of works above some high-quality threshold, according to critics, stays flat. Now, for lots of reasons, we might not trust what the critics say. They're snobs, they don't represent the views of regular people or the consumption patterns of regular people. So another approach would be to look at actual data on some sort of consumption. So either sales or airplay by calendar year and vintage. So let me start explaining this geeky approach here. In any given year, you'll see that current stuff sells more than older stuff. So that's just depreciation. Older stuff generates less sales. So in 2010, the biggest share of sales are recent, 2010, 9, 8, and so forth, just sort of declining pretty steadily back to earlier vintages. So that tells us there is depreciation. Now, after accounting for depreciation, though, are some vintages sold or used more than others? If so, that would tell us something about the quote, quality of those underlying vintages. When I do the decomposition along those lines, using either airplay data or some sales data based on the Recording Industry Association of America certifications, this is what I find. The left slide is based on airplay. Quality by this measure rises from about 60 to 70, which by the way is exactly what happened in the critic data, although these are entirely independent. And then it falls, kind of remains low through the 90s. What happens then after the Napster period is a great increase in the apparent quality. And using entirely independent data on the right-hand side, sales data, I get very much the same pattern. A substantial growth in quality by this measure, or service flow, or some less sort of tendentious word. But something good seems to have happened in a period in which revenue is just really tanked. How about movies? Well, in movies, what I have, I can look at Rotten Tomatoes, for example, and I can show you that the number of movies that get pretty good grades at Rotten Tomatoes, which by the way is an aggregator that translates critics into scores, 0 to 100, and these are all kind of, A's and A pluses kind of scores. The number of pretty high scoring movies has grown pretty substantially since about 1993. Now, by the way, although these are the views of critics, I could also show you that critics and lay users have pretty correlated tastes, so this is correlated with the stuff that moves demand around. And it's also true that a growing share of this has to be from independents, because after all, the absolute number of major studio movies is pretty constant, even declining. Well, what about books? What about books? In books, as I mentioned, there's this explosion in self-published titles, most of which are surely things you don't want to read. But surprisingly, and so most of these are things that probably attract no sales at all. But if you look at the USA Today bestseller list, which is a weekly list of the top 150 titles, and you figure out which of those originally appeared as a self-published work, what turns out, there's been really substantial growth from 0 to a number like 15% of titles being those that were originally self-published. And all that growth occurs between like 2011 and the present. If you look at the romance genre, it actually goes from 0 to about 45%. This is by title, not by sales, so it's not all driven by 50 Shades of Grey. Although 50 Shades of Grey is 3 books and 4 entries because the box set is a separate entry. All right, so summing up, there has been a revenue crisis in music, and there are looming threats in other media. But costs have fallen, and new products are exploding. It looks to me like a golden age of plentiful and appealing products, at least according to the data. In fact, I would call it a digital renaissance. I'm writing a book with that title, based on papers that have appeared in Wall Street Journal. All right, so that leaves us coming back to Mike. What should industry do? Well, first of all, listen to Mike. Honestly, he's really doing the good work careful work that shows you what are the effects, what can you do in response, or what are the responses to things one can do. And I would say the concern about revenue is absolutely understandable. So I don't want to diminish that. I mean, after all, I'm a professor, and online teaching is about to put me out of business, so I know what you feel. But another point is that there have been cost reductions. There's been good news along with the bad news, and some firms are taking advantage of these cost reductions. It tends to be the sort of insurgent players, but to the extent that one can take advantage of those and not merely see the threats coming from the bad news on the demand side, that there are some opportunities. And of course, fighting piracy is a natural strategy. But then there's what should policy do? Well, the copyright industry barometers look strong. Perhaps surprisingly, the revenue crisis hasn't manifested itself in the production incentive crisis. So I'm not saying, therefore, we shouldn't care about stealing. There are, of course, other reasons to care about stealing. Well, there being the Ten Commandments, one of them. So that's my story. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And our next speaker is Alejandro Zentner, who Alejandro is an associate professor of managerial economics at the Jindal School of Management at the University of Texas at Dallas.
Yeah, I think I'm going to do it from here because I don't think I can handle both at the same time. Thank you, Tom, for inviting me to this panel. It's nice to hear again Mike's work, which is very nice, and also the comments, amazing comments by Joe Wolfowell. Is this working? Yes. So I started working on these topics when I was a PhD student at the University of Chicago in 2001. And Gary Becker, who passed away this week, included a question in his exam related to copying. That I have to admit, I think I didn't answer it very well, but over the past 10, 15 years, I think we have learned a lot from the research on these topics, but we still have a lot of things to learn. And I'm happy to be here and to offer my views on these topics. So I'm going to start from the basics, what Joel was mentioning before. Why do we have patents or copyright? And the idea is to incentivize innovation. So if you think about drugs, if you introduce competition in the market, then the price of the drugs more people will get treatment because the price is lower. But perhaps this will reduce the amount of innovation of new drugs. All right. So what does this have to do with file sharing? When it was introduced in 1999, researchers thought that file sharing was going to reduce the incentives to create new work, and that's why many economists got interested in studying this question. All right, so I'm a professor, I teach, so I couldn't contain myself. I will have a graph here. This is a simple theory of the demand and supply. Here you have on the vertical axis the price, on the horizontal axis the quantity. What happens when you introduce file sharing in this market? Well, you can think of it in different ways. One way that Mike has talked about before is, well, this is like introducing a cheap alternative for the original, and then the demand will shift to the left, and then you have a reduction in the quantity of music that is sold. All right, so quantity decreases from Q to Q prime. So remember, this is 1999. So this exam was in 2001. So we didn't know what happened with sales. So people at that time thought, well, there is an alternative story to this, and it's that perhaps people will use file sharing platforms to learn about new music, and then that will induce them to buy more music because they learn about new music, they sample new music. This is how we call it in this literature. This is the sampling effect. And the analogy here was that you go into a supermarket and they give you a tiny piece of cake, let's say, and you buy a piece of cake, and then they give you this with the hope that you're going to buy the cake, all right? I think a better analogy would be that you go to a supermarket, they give you 10 cakes, and then cake is coming out of your eyeballs, and then perhaps you're not going to buy any. But we didn't know at the time what story was going to be true. So now we know more. I think we are coming to an understanding that piracy reduced sales. So if you think about, this is similar to what the graph that Joel presented before. If you look at sales in the US and internationally, they went down by a lot. You can slice this data in different ways. So this is 1999 and 2013. When you compare money, you have to adjust for inflation. If you did adjust for inflation there, this will be the drop. So it's a bit bigger, but anyways, that you slice it, you get a very important decrease in sales of music. Okay, we still are not seeing changes like this for other industries, like for example for movies, although DVD sales went down by a lot. So this is the graph again. So what happened is sales went from Q to Q prime. So we did this in many different ways. The original studies, we used data aggregated by countries, we used individual level data. Mike came up with some very nice ways of measuring it. So here, what Mike did is, we are in D prime already, and let's see what happens if we shift the demand from D prime to D, and that can be shifted in two studies that he presented today. One is the Hadopi paper. There, individuals in France, they find that pirating may bring legal cost, and then D prime shifts to D, and the other one is the mega upload case where copies disappear, and then that increases the demand for originals. All right? So in all this literature, we are forgetting about something that this is more as a footnote. That is important here is that when you have a shift in demand, the price may come down from B to B prime. Okay? So many of these studies, we are analyzing quantities and not considering what happened to prices. And perhaps prices went down significantly. And there are some stories some evidence in the story, historical evidence, like from the 19th century, of what happens with piracy, and the price went down by a lot when that happened. And you can think things like about price segmentation here. What happened with the price segmentation? This is relevant to the pricing strategies that companies use. And you can think, for example, at other things like what would the price of a digital download be in the absence of piracy, if piracy didn't exist. And I think the price of a digital download would be a lot more expensive than what it is if companies didn't have to compete with free. All right? But that's just a conjecture. I don't know the answer to that. That's a difficult question to answer, and this is why we haven't done a lot of research on that margin. All right. So the second question. So we are coming to an understanding that that revenues decrease because of piracy, at least for music. I think we still need more research for other cases like books or movies. But after we solve this question, or we come to an understanding on this question, we can study what is the effect on the supply of talent. All right. So if revenues didn't decrease, then it wouldn't make much sense to study this question to start with. And the reason for why we have concentrated, most of the research has concentrated in studying revenues is because it's a lot easier. And Joel is doing a great work in studying what is the supply of talent, what is the effect of this decrease in revenues on the supply of talent. And I have some remarks on this. So suppose that file sharing, that we were finding that file sharing did not affect creation. So how do we interpret this? So there are different ways to interpret this. One is that the supply of talent is not responsive to monetary incentives. So the supply of talent, we call it in economics, inelastic. All right? So if you are born a singer, a musician, and then you are not going to become a basketball player because the incentives go down. That's one interpretation of the result. The second interpretation is that the cost went down at the same time that revenues went down. Actually, the monetary incentive didn't change. All right? So these two interpretations are different, and it would be good to know which of these ones is the correct way to interpret this. So suppose that we think that the supply of talent is inelastic, so the supply doesn't respond to incentives. So we have studied this question for other markets. Economists have studied this question, for example, to analyzing what is the elasticity of supply of labor and how it responds to tax increases. And there is a lot of research on both sides, and we have political debates on this, but we still don't know how much a change in revenues is going to, a change in income is going to affect how much you work or how much it affects GDP. All right? So in that case, if we are thinking that the supply of talent is inelastic, then we are analyzing a question like this. But we can think that that cost actually didn't change very much. So then another thing is how, suppose that we find that financial did not affect creation, all right? So, but if we think that now the cost of creation is lower, is a lot lower, what do we want? Do we want the same amount of creation that we would have had without this cost decrease? Or we want more creations? Now it's become cheaper to create more. Do we want more creation? Perhaps now that it's cheaper, we want to induce even more creation than before, right? So these are different ways to interpret this. It might be too early to study it for some industry, for example, for the movie industry, because we still don't know by how much or how big. It is not certainly as big as the effect that we have found on record sales yet, also the decline in sales. And it's very difficult to, or impossible to extrapolate across industries. So in the case of movies, you have fixed costs it's very difficult to create a movie with a low budget and a good movie that people will want to watch in masses, all right? So we cannot extrapolate, we cannot use the findings that we have for music, for other industries, or for, like, for example, for movies. Measuring quality is very difficult, okay? So economists, we don't know very well how to measure quality. Joel is doing this extraordinary work in trying to measure it, and he said, well, are critics snob, and does that coincide with market preferences? So what do critics, for example, think about Britney Spears, okay? So perhaps they don't like and they are happy not to have it, but that brings a lot of sales for the industry, right? So, and then we can evaluate not only the quantity of creation, but we can evaluate other margins. So, for example, what are the types of music? So musicians in the past, perhaps they liked classical music, but they became rock musicians because that gave more money. But now perhaps they are going to keep doing classical music. Or now musicians get a lot of money from concerts. So in a concert you have to perform, you have to dance. Perhaps dancing is now more important than singing than it was before. Right? So there are many issues in this second literature, which is how this decrease in revenues is going to affect the creation of music. So we have these two topics. One is how it affected creation, how it affected revenues, and the other one is how it affected creation. And I think on this second question, we have a lot of work still to do. Right. So thank you.
Thank you, Orlando. Picking up on some of the things that Alejandro said, as I interpreted that, actually this was a question I had beforehand about Joel's work and see if the interpretation is correct. So as I understand what you're saying is that there's the effect of piracy, and then there's the effect of costs, and to some extent on the production of new goods, or quality adjusted new goods, and to some extent they've just offset each other. So, but the correct interpretation, let me ask this a question, the interpretation of that would be that in the absence piracy, the cost reduction would still have been there, and so the production of new goods would have increased.
Yeah, no, as a principled matter, it's surely got to be true. You know. So then there is this question that Alejandro raised: how much creative activity would be the optimal amount now? And you know, we've lived through this compound experiment, which we had enormous bad news on the demand side and enormous good news on the supply side. And it seems as though we are, in some sense, better off in terms of the new products coming to market. But maybe it's merely a golden age, and it should have been a platinum age. But that's a rather different argument than the argument that the sky is falling. But you're still completely right. If you just had good news on the supply side, no bad news on the demand side, the world would be a better place for production of stuff or creation of stuff than if you had bad news plus good news.
And I think it's piggybacking on that a little bit. I'm doing work with one of Joel's students, Brett Danaher, and we think we've found some evidence that output would be, you know, we would be in a better world if piracy hadn't, if piracy didn't exist.
Okay, can I jump on that? Because I'm doing some work with Mike's colleague Rahul, and it's a very incestuous little world. But
One happy family. Right?
One happy family, and it's preliminary. I don't know if it will kill me for mentioning this, but you know, if you look at some there are contexts in which reductions in revenue seem to have brought about big reductions in the supply of new products. For example, you know, India around the time the cable piracy started. So it's not as though, you know, it's not as though piracy is good news. Surely not. And in some, you know, it's often hard to find direct supply impacts of it, but there are some contexts where one can.
Does anybody else on the panel have something to say?
Yeah, I think I agree with Joel's answer to your question. I think perhaps in the absence of piracy, we would have had a lot more creation. And now that the cost of creation is low, perhaps it makes sense to create more than before because it's cheaper to do it.
I'm going to throw this open to Stan.
Stan Besson, isn't it important to distinguish between the effect?
Stan, could you wait for the microphone, please?
I think I can speak pretty loud without it.
Well, you want to get it?
It's just easier to record.
Isn't it important to distinguish between the effect of technical change on first copy costs and on the cost of additional production? For example, book publishers argue that even though it's much less expensive to produce one more copy of an e-book than a hard copy book, that a very large proportion of their total costs are unchanged by having them be e-books. So isn't it important to distinguish between those the two effects of the technical change you talked about?
Anybody?
I'll go first too. I should wait to think, but yes, indeed. But I think, you know, in books, for example, you know, big parts of the costs are really kind of the filtering. You know, which manuscript of those that I might champion should I go ahead and champion, and then the marketing for those that I decide to champion. And it is true that for the traditional business model of, you know, sort of relying on words of agents and reading manuscripts, that those costs really haven't changed. But I guess the social question is, do the books that had ought to get published? And now, even without going through the traditional gatekeepers, one can, it seems, release one's own book, and it does seem to get discovered through whatever channel. So, for example, you know, Goodreads, which Amazon now owns, has 20 million reviews, about 700,000 books. That's user-generated reviews. That's more reviews than the sum total of all the different products reviewed in conventional channels. So, although it is true that the landscape from the standpoint of a traditional media firm, the first copy costs really haven't changed that much. Even that's a little bit debatable. But somebody can, at very low first copy cost, release a product to the market, and it seems that it is possible for many of the functions that had been done by the traditional intermediary to get done by some other mechanism, whether it be social media or some other product or product discovery, so that the stuff gets created cheaply and gets found without somebody making a big investment on a product that 9 times out of 10 fails. I mean, that's, I guess, something that I didn't have time to talk about, but in all these industries, success is incredibly difficult to predict. So 9 out of 10 of the products released by big traditional media firms are failures. And that's with the best minds working on the problem. So given that, there are probably a lot of successes in the ones that didn't make it past the traditional gatekeepers, if only they can be discovered. And the fact that a lot of the self-published books, for example, end up being bestsellers indicates, although we don't quite understand how, that plenty of this stuff that doesn't incur the traditional first copy cost model that we worry about, nevertheless ends up as successful products.
I would only react that we all like to have it published in peer-reviewed journals. And you don't want to read every working paper that comes out.
No, we don't. But somebody, no, I completely agree. And I'm publishing my book with a traditional publisher, so I'm world's biggest editor.
But look, just before I get that, I mean, in terms of the production costs, it's not first copy production costs. Presumably, there's variation across the various creative industries. Books are not the same as movies.
Oh yeah. Well, and I think Joel's saying that there might be some change in the fixed cost, but it's still high. The interesting thing is, how do we change the selection process, right? And I was going to say something very similar, but not quite as eloquently as what you did. If Joel's right, and I think he very well might be, that we're changing the selection process, then who owns the data associated with that is going to be very, very important. And Joel dropping that Goodreads, which is now owned by Amazon, is not an arbitrary statement, right? Amazon wants as much data as they can have about who likes what and how much. Netflix wants as much data as they can have about who likes what and how much, and on and on and on. That's going to be the interesting game that we're going to see the next 10 years.
Can I make just one first copy cost follow-up? I'm sorry to be so wordy, but in movies, although it is true that the MPAA movies cost $100 million to make, they stopped releasing the data, but it still seems to be true. On the other hand, since the development of the Canon, 5D, the digital camera, the $2,000 digital still camera that also takes high-quality digital video, there has been an explosion in the number of movies at IMDb. Now, most of the 3,000 aren't actually commercially available. But while there are only 500 that make it to theaters for a given release year, twice as many are available to be purchased via Amazon, either streaming or by some means. And some of these turn out to actually be somewhat successful. Like HBO buys them and you'll see them on television. So the first copy cost of those movies, rather than needing a camera that is rented but would cost $250,000, it costs a couple thousand. Now I realize that's only a small fraction of production costs for a big deal movie, but for a little deal movie, even with famous actors who will go and make these with their friends, these can turn out to be economically consequential products.
Yeah, I'd like to add that I think there is a big difference between music. I feel that it's a lot easier to record. It's a lot easier to record an album because it's a lot cheaper. The fixed cost involved in doing that are much lower than producing a movie. Although the cost of producing a movie has gone down for non-commercial movies, I think I would have my guess would be that the response for movies would be substantially more drastic than we are going to find for music.
Matt Shears with CCIA. Can I offer at least what I think my synthesis is from what I've heard, particularly from Mike and Joel's presentation thus far, and sort of I'm here if you guys think I'm going in the right direction or not. So a lot of both the first two presentations seem to point to lots of economic irrationality, right? So firms window in cases where there's no money to be made from windowing. The mega upload shutdown showed that people could have still pirated things online, but chose lawful alternatives. Hadopi drove people to lawful alternatives, even though their legal risk hadn't actually increased, right? So there's all cases where people are either because of lack of good information or just perception not doing things necessarily rationally. And Joel's comment about online education threatening sort of professional faculty, right? In a lot of those cases, that education is not necessarily economically rational, right? I mean, we're in a sense competing with things that are entirely unlikely to make money for the people. I'm an adjunct too. I'm particularly sensitive because you guys have tenure, right? But as soon as my value proposition goes away, I'm done. So in all these cases, there seem to be a lot of people behaving.
We apologize, by the way.
Look, there's a lot of people behaving irrationally. And that's entirely relevant to the copyright conversation because we have, it's an incentive system and it's sort of founded on the expectation that people respond rationally to an incentive. And so let me just sort of offer that out there and hear what you guys think.
I'm hesitant to say irrationally. I think in the case of Mega Upload, what people are saying is, I knew how to use Mega Upload, it went away, I could go and search for another site and figure out how to use it. I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm just going to buy it on iTunes. I think you can model that as a perfectly rational decision. Hadopi strikes me as very similar to that, right? There is potentially an increased legal risk. There is an increased awareness of the illegality of this activity, and I'm going to change my behavior. And again, I think you can model that in an entirely rational way.
Well,
The
but
search
with
costs-
Adobe, your data showed that the change happened before the legal risk had actually accrued, right? That there was the perception of the risk because they were reading about it in the paper.
Absolutely, right? So I don't, and honestly, and we're very clear in the paper, I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means the people thought it was already sort of it had already been enacted. And if you think about the number of people who know who the vice president is, that doesn't strike me as implausible that they would not be paying careful attention to what's going on. It's also entirely possible that they said, hey, people care about this. People are getting hurt by this. I'm going to stop. So I don't necessarily. I'm always hesitant to use the word irrational. I think they're behaving differently than we expected them to. But I think you could model it as entirely rational behavior. Will my economist, my fellow economists agree with
I
that?
mean, I think it's a pretty, I think it's a pretty straightforward story, exactly what you'd expect. If you raise the cost of piracy, you get less piracy. If you lower the cost of getting things through legitimate channels, you also get less piracy. It's exactly what economics would predict.
I thought you were accusing the producers of being irrational, in which case we could talk about that.
I mean, I actually think that's that would have been a valid, another point where we do see some irrational behavior.
I mean, but there, I would defend them just in the sense that, the music guys look the most irrational. But these are the guys who are the canaries in the coal mine. I mean, rationality you can't sort of be clairvoyant. You look at all the other industries have responded to the digital threats. They seem to have learned really fast. I mean, look at how TV learned from, within a few months after YouTube exists, they're selling stuff, and within a year, they're making everything freely available. Like very rapid learning. I would call it hyper-rational. So for us, calling people irrational is like fighting words. So.
I mean, just to pick up the chain of that conversation, David Green from NBC Universal, when you overlay sort of our studies of focus groups and consumer studies on these issues, we find that a lot of people do see, when you have a Napster, when you have the easily accessible pirated product, they see it, well, it must be okay because there's no interference whatsoever, and if this was really wrong, there would be some sort of friction in the system. So when you introduce Hadopi, people hear, oh, wait a minute, this is a problem, you can get in trouble. When you hear Mega Upload, well, these guys have been indicted and shut down by the Justice Department. It adds information, and they say, well, wait a minute, maybe this isn't okay. And that was one of the things that led to people's behavior. That's what we get from the consumer survey side.
The other thing about I think that's 100% right? And that's sort of what I was saying. Okay, this is wrong. I get it. Now I'm gonna switch over. The other thing is I've seen people look at our Hadopi study and say, well, the conclusion is that the enforcement didn't have an effect on behavior. We don't know whether that's. I don't know what would have happened in a world where Hadopi was all education and no enforcement. So I would be hesitant to draw that conclusion.
Yeah, I would like to add that I think these measures really work, and if you analyze like evidence, global evidence from other countries, you see like the piracy rate in other countries where piracy is not as enforced as it is here, is much higher. So only comparing what my friends, I am from Argentina, what my friends in Argentina do and what people, my friends here, perhaps it's a different kind of friends, but nonetheless, I feel that there is like, they feel free and no problem, they have no problems downloading anything from the internet.
Rick Lane from 21st Century Fox. The cost of writing a book is really just your own personal time. And so it's very low cost in that sense, even though your time can be valuable. I mean, if it's a CEO of a Fortune 500 writing a book, their time, you do per hour versus a starving artist, right? And so there is little cost and barriers to entrance. As you move to music, it's a little bit different. You get a little bit more cost. The cost of writing the song maybe, but producing it, buying the equipment, the guitars, whatever it happens to be, even if you're recording it on an iPad, you start steeping up. Video games start getting a little bit more expensive in terms of cost, programming, you start steeping. Then you get to movies. By the way, our CEO of our Fox film, if they could have done Avatar with a $3,000 camera, they would have done it, okay? Believe me. But what you have seen is because of the $3,000 camera, which I had purchased because I love the HD for other, for sports, for my kids' sports. The fact is that the competition is raising the cost. So a movie like Avatar, if you think about it, Sigourney Weaver was the biggest actress or an actor in that movie, and is not an A actor. Yet that movie cost $300 million plus. It was all the technology that went into it. And if you look at a movie like Rio 2, you go and see the supercomputers that we're using to do the incredible algorithms to make that animation look as real as possible. Those are not cheap. Those are highly educated, skilled mathematicians doing algorithms and have a creativity spark in their brain, and very hard to find. Or you look at DreamWorks or any of the others out there. So I think sometimes we miss this because it's different levels of cost, and yes, there is a lowering of costs of great products, digital services, and editing devices. But at the same time, you're seeing the cost of movies go up, and same with television shows, the cost, because you're competing against Game of Thrones, which is a 10 million plus per episode show. You can't have some crappy show on your network and hope to get any advertisers or any type of revenue. So I think it's a little bit misleading to say that because you have cheap devices, that you're not going to have a cost increase, because we're always on the cutting edge, and that's why you get a $100 million investment. And you can't do that and just throw it out on an Amazon site and hope you get good reviews. I mean, you really need the marketing behind it and everything else, because when you're making a big bet of $300, $400 million on a movie, or $200 million, or 100, or 40, you got to put the other upfront costs to make sure that people see it. And I think that gets lost a little bit in some of these discussions.
I think that's 100% right? So I think you can make a strong argument that the cost associated with making the movies we made 5 years ago have gone down. What you're saying is the equilibrium response is we make a different sort of movie, and the cost of those movies actually might have gone up.
Expectations are higher.
Yep, and that seems like a perfectly reasonable story, and that's why I think one interesting compliment to Joel, the very nice work Joel is doing, is asking the question, if there was less piracy on those sorts of cutting-edge movies, would we get more output on those sorts of movies?
Look, I think if you look at just Bollywood, you don't get those type of movies in Bollywood because they just don't, the piracy is so bad that you can't get the economic investment. Yeah, there's a lot of talent there. And so it's not that they don't know how to do it, they just can't get the money to do it.
So I think, like I said, he's 100%. I'm like 85% with you. In the sense that there are certainly, if you look, there's a spectrum of movies, that's for sure. And there are kind of expensive movies and inexpensive movies. On the expensive movies, some of those expenses are in some sense real expenses. That is, it really costs that much to pixelate or whatever word Some of those expenses, though, are high simply because the revenue is high. You bid up the price of Brad Pitt. $20 million per movie is a price that you pay because there's high revenue, because you sell it abroad and so forth. So, there are some real costs that are high at the kind of high quality end of the spectrum. Now, at the same time, there is this, this whole spectrum of movies, and there's this pretty incontrovertible fact that even though there have been threats to revenue, the number of movies made, even the number of movies that are released in some sense and that are somehow economically consequential has increased. So that has to tell us that the costs of making things have gone down at some part of the spectrum. So I mean, when I say I'm like 84% with you, it is true. At the top, the MPAA movies, especially the expensive ones, many of the expenses are real and really cannot be avoided in order to make an appealing product. So I mean, I'm not saying that there's no benefit. I like Spider-Man. I want to see Spider-Man 17. So I need I need for Hollywood to be able to protect its revenue streams. Yeah.
But it's hard to differentiate. I mean, if you're talking about content protection, to say we're only going to protect those that are valued at 40 million versus those that are valued. And a perfect example is 12 Years a Slave. Relatively low cost, no real famous actors. Brad Pitt did a little piece in there, but it was his production, so I'm sure he didn't quite pay himself scale. But you have a movie like that that's incredibly powerful, life-changing, historical, and wins the Academy Award. That should be as protected, because you won't get movies like that made if it's just going to be pirated out of the box.
I think I agree also with you, like 100%, like Mike.
All right, I knew the dial.
So what's the average? 93.
Very nice.
And I think you are raising this point that we cannot extrapolate across different products. We cannot extrapolate albums to movies and so on. And the other thing is one point that Mike raised before, which is about price segmentation. So if you produce a very high budget movie and people are going to pirate it, then you will not be able to milk all these windows. So that's a problem for the pricing strategy that the studios can make. So this way.
And piracy hurts those movies more than the big ones, because you want to see an Avatar on a big screen.
That's the interesting question, right? Is you might imagine a world where piracy takes 10% off the top, right? In that sort of world, Spider-Man 17 is still going to get made. It's still profitable. What you wonder is, are there a set of movies where if you take 10% off the top, that movie is no longer profitable? And that to me is an interesting question. I think Joel's made an interesting first cut at that. But we're still searching, as I understand it, we're still searching for would we get more of those would we get even more of those sorts of movies if piracy were limited?
Hey, may I make a provocative observation?
Yes.
So in the last 25 years, there's a different slow-moving quote experiment. Hollywood figured out windowing and international distribution. Yeah. Real revenue went up by, I think, a factor of 4. Now, the number of movies released by the majors didn't increase. Budgets did increase. An interesting question is, did quality, in some meaningful sense, increase? Did the appeal of movies of these vintages relative to other vintages increase? If it were the case that these movies were better, in the sense of having higher appeal relative to movies from other vintages, then we would have gotten something. Then that investment would have gotten us something. It didn't get us quantity. Okay, so we are told, worry about threats to revenue because the gaffer and the key grip will lose their jobs, which is a story about the quantity of production will go down. But when we ran the other, quote, slow-moving, quote, experiment, where we quadrupled revenue, we did not get an increase in the number of movies. We did get an increase in investment. So I think the open question, I'm not trying to tell the answer, but say, I think the question is, what did we get for that? And if we just spent more money not to produce more economic value, then we didn't get much. And if we spent less money, we'd still be as happy. That is the consumers. But on the other hand, if we did get something more, then this investment was valuable. So we have run through some slow-moving experiments that may be informative about this, and I'm working on it, and call me next year.
And if you're looking across platforms, not just theaters.
Yeah.
Matt Shears again. I wanted to follow up on the sort of who's hurt more by piracy. So I think we had our two examples were 12 Years a Slave and Spider-Man 17. My takeaway from Joel's stats were that it's the other way. We see a lot of entry from small producers and sort of flatlining production by the larger producers. So my sense is, you know, that, I mean, assuming you have a somewhat even distribution of piracy correlated to exposure, that Spider-Man 17 would suffer a lot more. Well, 12 Years a Slave isn't a good example because it had so much acclaim. But other works published with that budget would have less acclaim. Certainly they're not going to be up for all these awards. And so in that circumstance, I would think that Spider-Man 17 would suffer far more. But, you know, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
So I think I'm going to answer your question, but if I don't, ask it again. I think what Joel's saying is the net impact of a bunch of things that have happened over the past 10 years or so is that we've seen more output from the independents, the small people than we were before. That includes both the technological changes and the changes to the business model and the impact of piracy. One question you might ask is, if you were to reduce piracy while still keeping those other changes the same, would you see even more output? That's the question that's the question I think we still haven't answered. Is that?
Yeah, no, you did a good job of saying what I should have said if I understood.
It's all about the counterfaction.
Yeah.
I should have a T-shirt with that.
Since the disconnect between revenues and production in the music field, Joel found is so striking, I was wondering exactly what revenues are being picked up there. Is the baseline consistent across time? And is it just the official music industries and not like concert performances and that sort of thing?
So my revenue data are just recorded music revenue, and it doesn't include concert, live performance. It doesn't include any of the ancillary stuff. It doesn't even include things like streaming revenue. So it's just revenue from selling the not physical, but the either digital or physical purchase. And so a complementary story about, well, why is it that artists are still creating stuff would be that, well, these are not the whole sources of revenue. And if you have all the revenue sources, then maybe there's enough there to justify continued investment. And I think that's right. I mean, there's evidence. Alan Kruger and co-authors have papers showing that ticket prices and ticket revenues for live performance have both increased, and that the model has sort of switched from the traditional model of a concert tour as a promotion for the album to the other way around, as the unprotectable recorded music product as a promotion for the the protectable concert revenue. I mean, the only thing so I would say, first of all, that's a complimentary story about how copyright is currently working, or why it is working as well as it is, whether it's working well or not. But the other thing is that they could have done this before, and they didn't. So this probably isn't it's probably not better for the industry to do it this way. I mean, maybe they were just doing it wrong before, thinking that concerts should promote albums. Maybe they just were confused. But if they weren't just confused, then this is a second best kind of adaptation from your standpoint.
Do you know if anyone is looking at a comprehensive way at these alternative other revenue streams? Because you have to sit and think what they would be for one.
Well, piecemeal. I mean, so Peter DeCola at Northwestern has been doing studies of various sources of revenue for rights holders, so songwriters, and where do you get your money? And Julie Mortimer and Alan Sorensen have papers on concert. So piecemeal. Nobody's doing it all at once, but various different folks, and I could talk to you about different studies. Maybe
Any more questions? Scott?
So there was discussion about what happens to movies at the high end. Is there anything we can learn about music on the high end? Or is the scale just so different that you can't? I mean, are concerts more elaborate? Do they have more elaborate videos? Anything about the high end of music that might inform something about
I don't think there is work. I don't think there is work done on these issues, but my personal observation is that concerts now are more elaborated, and you have more people dancing and doing stuff than singing than it was before. But I am not old enough to perhaps know how it was before.
You're not young enough either.
This is kind of a subset of, I mean, it's related to Rick's question, right?
It is.
It is, do we see it, do we also see it in music? Do we also see it in books? I don't think we see it in books. You know, and music, I'm with you. You know, there's been some shift, but nothing as dramatic as Avatar.
Yeah, but I think it's similarly. There are these two ends of the spectrum. I mean, I think there are lots of concerts at sort of dive bars now. There are a lot of small acts can release their stuff digitally, not get any revenue, and attract 100 people to a local bar. So I think there's growth at that tail. But I think at the same time, there's intensity of competition at the upper end. And so I think both things are happening at once. And so it's probably misleading to focus just on one.
Just one last point. You know, if you look at the middle and the lower movies, you have movies that go to Sundance and all the movies that go to Sundance and all the different film festivals. I mean, it's an incredible experience to see the amount of talent. Also, you see a lot of stuff that you're like, why did they even make this at that level too? And we have professional staff at Fox Searchlight that go to all these shows, all these events to find that gem out there. Beast of the Southern Wild is a perfect example of one that was done by a guy who, his first movie, not one person had ever acted in a movie before. The person who played the father was the guy who owned the bakery across the street from where they were holding the auditions and brought them donuts every morning. And they said, hey, do you want to try? And he said yes, and he decided to close his bakery while he filmed, and became part of this incredible movie that did finally reach to the top for Best Director and Best Supporting Actress, the youngest of all time in history. So when you're talking about movies at that level, people don't understand our industry, because we don't make movies. We are investors in those who make movies. We are distributors, we buy movies. So looking at the statistics of the lower end, we're the ones who are going to bring those up. Slumdog Millionaire almost ended up straight to DVD. We picked it up, marketed it, and became an Academy Award winning movie.
But I would just say that's sort of precisely the point. If you empower lots of people to make low-budget movies, most of them are crap, a few of them are great. If Fox Searchlight can discover them, then we're all going to be better off. But the fact that any schmo with a $2,000 camera can make a movie, and not a great one, but 1 in 1,000 of them is great. The fact that that has been democratized means that there's more stuff to choose from, and we're going to pluck some winners out of the urn. You just described plucking winners out of the urn.
But that's only because we know we can get a return on investment.
Yeah, fine, but the point is you don't need as much investment to pluck a winner that costs $10,000,
Sure you do.
$20,000.
Sure you do.
As much. You don't need as much. If it costs $30 million versus $1 million, you need $299 million less.
But
right?
it's greater risk because you don't have the stars.
Yes.
I think this raises the point of a compound experiment. So we have many things going on at the same time. So we have costs going down, and then we have piracy. And certainly the cost going down is going to increase the production, but then piracy would work perhaps in the other direction.
Well, I'd like to thank the panel for really great presentations, and thank you all for coming.
I think I drove David Green.